Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillahi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Allahumma ya munawwir ya fattah. نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We begin in the name of God Almighty. We beseech Him to send His peace and blessings upon our beloved Master and Prophet Muhammad and upon his family and his companions and all of those who walk in His path with excellence until the last day. Alhamdulillah. So now we're on the section of Ṭahārah here in this text on Mālikī Fiqh, al-Murshid, al-Muʿīn of Sidi Abdul Wahid ibn Ashir rahimahullah ta'ala. And he begins this section by saying فصل وتحصل قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل وتحصل الطهارة بماء من التغير بشيء سلم إذا تغير بنجس طرح أو طاهر لعادة قد صلح أو طاهر لعادة قد صلح إلا إذا لازمه في الغالب كمغرة فمطلق كالذائب. So ritual purification is obtained through the use of pure water that is free of alteration by something external to it. So Ibn Ashir begins with Ṭahārah because Ṭahārah or ritual purification is a condition, it's a shart to the prayer itself. Typically, the first action that we're going to be looking at in terms of religious legal praxis is prayer. But in order to pray, one has to know how to make wudu. And then in order to understand wudu, then one has to understand the concept of water, right? That which we make our wudu from. So it implies that we need to understand what is involved insofar as the legal discourse is concerned on the subject of water, which is a prerequisite to our objective. So he begins the discussion with water. And water is actually, it's an incredible substance. It's a vital source of life. I think one statistic that I read said that more than 70% of our bodies are composed of water. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that He has created every living thing from water. وجعلنا من الماء كل شيء حي. وجعلنا من الماء كل شيء حي. We've created every living thing from water. So water, is truly something that is phenomenal. We take it for granted. We don't really think about it. But people who do think about it, like if you talk to someone who's a scientist, for instance, who studies water, they're profoundly amazed by it. For example, water is the only substance that we know expands when it cools. And they knew this, as a matter of fact, in the pre-modern world, and they would use it to their advantage. So, people would quarry stone by pouring water into the crevices of cliffs before the frost came in the winter, particularly in the northern hemisphere. And that's actually how they would quarry stones. That's actually something that, communities here in the States, in the South actually, they knew this and they would do things that were similar. But besides the physical or the material benefits that we take from water, water is also the foundation of our religious and spiritual lives. So our prayers, our religious decorums, all of it revolves around water. This also implies that it's very important to be mindful of how we use water. And water conservation, I would argue, is an extremely important project to our religion. For example, there's the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ comes up to Sa'ad, one of the companions, and he sees him being excessive in his use of water. And he tells him that, and Sa'ad says, is there excessiveness or wastefulness when it comes to wudu? And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, you know, وَلَوْ كُنْتَ عَلَى جَهْرٍ نَهْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ عَلَى نَهْرٍ جَارٍ, right? وَلَوْ كُنْتَ عَلَى نَهْرٍ جَارٍ. Even if you were in a flowing river, okay? So for us, this is a really strong indication that it's not about having access to resources. It's about how we use those resources and being mindful and being very intentional in terms of how we use those resources. So Ṭahārah or ritual purification is of two types, and we're going to talk about this. You have min al-khabath wal-hadath. Al-khabath is filth or najasa, okay, so to remove filth from oneself, impurities, which is going to necessitate using purifying water, and then hadath, which is when one has entered into a state of ritual impurity, whether it's a major ritual impurity, which is hadath al-akbar, or part of the body, which is the minor ritual impurity. And removing either of these requires pure water, ma'in mutlaq, as they say. Tahur, right? You'll talk about this term, ma'in tahur. Water that is purifying. And so this would include, typically speaking, anything that is conventionally or customarily understood as water. If your custom understands this substance to be water, one would say it's water. So anything that naturally flows from the earth, according to the Malikis, would be considered valid for Ṭahārah as well. So for example, rainwater, melted snow, we're not going to find that here. Well, maybe the people that go up to Big Bear, right, and come down. I was like, one of the first times I ever did that was with my wife. Assalamu alaikum. It was really odd because I come from Chicago and it snows there. So like we're used to snow, we know snow. and typically we try to stay away from it. And then there were people going up to Big Bear. I remember this, like, it's the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. They were going up and they would play in the snow, and then they would take some of the snow and they would put it on the top of their car and like put it on the top of and they would drive down the mountain like, we're coming back from the snow, right? And they have all this snow in the car. I looked at my wife once and I was like, is this really what goes down here? And she said, yeah, you don't do that. And I was like, no. I used to have to wake up in the morning and dread the whole experience of like getting rid of snow from the front of my car. Anyways, so snow is melted snow would be considered valid for one to use for Ṭahārah purposes. Also, fresh water, so like rivers and lakes, ocean water is also valid. Any underground aquifers, so like well water or springs, are also valid for Ṭahārah as well. So then he says, إذا تغير بنجس طرح أو طاهر لعادة قد صلح. So if it's changed by an impure substance, it must be discarded. But if it's changed by a pure substance, then it is still suitable for conventional, daily, non-devotional uses. So the idea here is that water that is pure, given that it is not changed in one of three ways, okay, and these three ways are taste, color, and smell. Taste, color, and smell would still be regarded as ma'in mutlaq, pure water. Now, this change in taste, color, or smell can be done through something which is itself pure, but not purifying, what's known as tahir, we'll talk about this in a second, or that which is impure. All right? So if we have pure water, what's known as tahur, this is water that is pure and purifies. All right? Something that is tahir would be that which is naturally occurring and not from what they say is the excrement of animals. So this would be including urine and feces, for example. Except, and this is a Mālikī exception here, except for animals that are permissible to eat. So, for example, cows, buffalo, oxen, lamb, sheep, goats, chickens, camels, duck, all of those would actually be seen as still tahir, according to the Mālikī madhhab. Okay? Yeah. And excrement in general from these animals. This is a Mālikī exception. I don't know what other school has this exception. So there are things that are tahir, okay, are pure in and of themselves, but are not purifying, generally speaking. All right? Rose water, for example, Sprite. Okay, we're not making wudu with Sprite, etc. And then you have things that are najis, okay, things that are ritually impure. So then he says if it's changed by an impure substance, it must be discarded. Okay, so pure water that is polluted by something that is najis, okay, itself becomes najis. So it's neither used at that point for general purposes nor for devotional acts. All right, and some said that it should really only be used at that point for agricultural purposes, like watering your grass, plants, and things like that, or else it's just thrown out. Again, mind you that we're looking at a text here from the post-classical period, right? So many of us might think to ourselves like, hey bro, is this really relevant? Like we just turn on the sink and we're good to go, right? And I get it, but at the same time I do think that there are very important principles for us to consider when looking at a subject matter like this. And it's good to know these things, and you'll come to see kind of how it all collates into a proper understanding of one's religion, irregardless of whether you're in Beverly Hills, Orange County, the middle of the village in Egypt or in Sudan or in West Africa or wherever you might be, right? You'll have an understanding, a proper conceptual understanding of how all of this works. So that's the point in terms of najasa being, if it comes into pure water, no longer can be used for devotional acts, and it is not used for general purposes. It's either thrown out or used for agricultural purposes. Now, if najasa, some filth, okay, najasa falls into a small quantity of water, one would say, like the water that's in a container for a person to go make wudu, or if one has a container of water, for example, for bathing purposes, whatever. But the filth itself does not affect any change in the water, then cleansing or purification with that water would still be seen as okay, permissible. But they say using it would be objectionable if you had other water to use. All right? Again, this principle goes into the basic principle that we started with in relationship to the concept of water and water conservation and understanding like what can still be used, what cannot be used. This is actually quite relevant for us here in California because, we can't even there are certain sectors of Southern California, for example, that you can get fined if you water your plants in the front yard on certain days, right? So, to me, this stuff is actually very relevant for that reason. So it's just good to know. Also, water that has been used for ablution already, okay? Somebody that's made wudu with water already or for bathing purposes would also still be considered to be pure in the madhhab. But once again, if you had other water, it would be objectionable that you would use that water over other water that's readily available. Okay, so pure water now that is changed with something that is tahir. If it's changed by a pure substance, it's still suitable for conventional daily non-devotional uses. Okay, so something that is something that changes the pure water, which itself is pure, tahir, but not purifying, is not to be used for devotional reasons, but it can be used for things like agricultural reasons, for cooking, for cleaning, etc. And that's generally how the ulama delineate the different types of usages. And then he says, unless it is something that is likely to be an intrinsic property, such as redness, then it is considered to be absolutely pure and purifying like melted snow. So the exception is when the water has been changed by something which is part of its intrinsic property. Okay? He mentions Chemogrotin, like sediments that run on a riverbed would be understood as a mughra. In other words, they're unavoidable. So this includes things like rust. Okay, sometimes you'll find that when you turn on the water, even in our sinks, there's like a reddish color that comes. This is from the pipes, right? We would say that that's something that's intrinsic. It's an intrinsic property coming from something that's unavoidable. It's still water. Okay, lime, totally okay. Sand, salt, chlorine. Sometimes you'll find, they obviously put chlorine to protect people. I wouldn't use pool water, but then you have fluoride.
But the pool water is more than 50 gallons. Is it different from Mālikī school?
It's more than 50 gallons of
water, so it's considered tahir. In Shafi'i school.
No, it is. Yes, it is. But what I'm saying is that I would just avoid generally pool water. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum.
What about water that is coming from a hot spring? Sometimes has like high level of minerals, like for example sulfur, or something to the extent.
Yes.
Would that water be considered good?
It would be, yes, because it's naturally flowing, right?
So tuhur?
Yes.
Okay.
Certain people obviously had questions around fluoride. So there are chemical agents, obviously, in our water, even in our tap water, for purification reasons. Certain scholars have opined on this and said that it would still fall into the category of a type of natural sediment, unless it becomes an irregular situation, right? And there's a lot of discussion that goes back and forth about this. I'm sure that all of you remember what happened to the community in Flint, and is still kind of an ongoing situation in certain regions as well. That water, as far as I'm concerned, that's just harmful water. And so at that point, one of my teachers, for example, said that they could just resort to tayammum because, and the drinking water that they have is for drinking, right? So, you wouldn't use the drinking water in that case for wudu anymore.
Water with like a bath bomb or something like that.
With a
bath bomb, like soap, for taking a bath.
Yeah, so that wouldn't be considered something that is like a natural sediment, So you would have to look and see, did it change color, taste, smell? And if it did, then it's no longer tahir anymore. That's actually the reason why certain Muslim regions, for example, when they do a wash cycle, they'll do 2 wash cycles. They'll do a wash cycle with just water, and then they'll do a wash cycle with the actual detergent. I know that they do that in Syria, for example. It's like a big thing in Syria.
So that would count in the washer instead of you rinsing whatever you need to rinse before you throw it in the washer? Because the washer is a small amount of water.
Well, it's not about whether it's a small amount or not. It's simply, whether or not the entirety of the material was, water actually encapsulated that material. So the idea is...
So does it have to run?
What do you mean?
When you do a washer, it sits in there and it mixes together. Like when you remove
With-
dirt from an object,
Yeah.
it usually has to run. No? Like run through, like.
Yeah, you just have to. Yeah, you just have to remove it. So if it's removed, that's sufficient. Yeah. And typically speaking, the pure water would do that. All right. Now, whether or not it actually runs, or you were able to simply just take water and remove it, without necessarily having flowing water, that's fine too. But the case in relationship to the wash cycle is if we're actually washing our clothes and the water that is washing it isn't actually ma'an mutlaq, it's not pure water because it's been mixed with detergent, would that still be considered then removing any type of najasa, for example, that would have been in those clothes? That's the question, right? So there's potentially a shubha. Right, if you know, for example, that there was something that was najas. And we'll go over what those things are.
Ustadh Fouad,
Yeah.
I have a real quick question for you, two really quick ones.
Yeah.
Am I thinking correctly that what we have is either changed water, be it changed by pure or impure, and then we have unchanged water even though something pure or impure went into it?
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
And then if it's unchanged either by pure or impure, or unadulterated, I think is the translation here,
Yeah.
then what is the case for either of those? If it remains unchanged, am I still able to do Ṭahārah? Can I still make my wudu or ghusl if it's unchanged by either pure or impure?
Yeah. So they say if it's unchanged by pure, there's no problem, and if it's unchanged by impure, then it would be recommended for you, if you did have pure, to use that water. If not, then it's fine.
Jazakallah khair. And last thing, in LA sometimes our water doesn't smell so nice, and I don't know if that's to do with the rust. I'm just wondering, it doesn't happen too often, but every so often the smell does come out, so I'm just curious on that.
It's a good question. I mean, I'm assuming that the reason is because of something that is unavoidable. In other words, it would be seen as a sediment that's running in the pipes. If that's the case, you would be fine. Do you know what it is? I mean, we should really be testing the water in LA too.
I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know.
Yeah,
And
you're fine.
question, when I go to a number of lakes sometimes, I'm not talking about the ones that are using recycled, I don't know, water, I'd say, from people's bathroom, but ones that aren't, but there are a lot of ducks and there are a lot of birds in that case. And I'd have to make a decision. I know in the Mālikī school that anything we can eat is pure, but I guess the question would be if it's changed or unchanged by the pure feces, right, or the pure urine of the particular animals. Would that be the thing that I'd be looking out for, that I'd be trying to decide, depending on the size of the lake? Because some of the lakes are somewhat smaller than others.
No, so I mean, there's also going to be a much larger discussion around the size of the water itself. So that should also be taken into consideration. I mean, when we're talking about a lake or something, a massive body of water, these types of things don't really apply anymore. It's only when you're talking about, and there are specific measurements for all of this. We'll get into that. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, though, because this is just a primer to get us going.
Thank you, Sheikh.
So, but yeah, inshallah, maybe after class or perhaps on the WhatsApp group, we can discuss this further, inshallah, me and you. Okay, so any questions about this? So what is Ṭāhir? Let me just go through really quickly, Majid. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I'll wait.
Okay, I just want to go through what is Ṭāhir, and then go through a couple of the aspects of what would also be najis, just because I know that these things are probably going to come up and I think it's important to square them away. So what is ṭāhir? We've already gone through the concept now. According to Imam Malik, every living thing is ṭāhir. All right? Sweat would also be regarded as ṭāhir. Blood, for example, he said, unless it comes out, is ṭāhir. Phlegm and saliva, including dogs and pigs, by the way. Okay? Including dogs and pigs. And this is like the big Mālikī thing. Right? Everybody that says, you know, you're a Mālikī? Oh, so you guys like have the dog thing, right? Like, what that means is that if a dog comes and licks you or puts his nose on you, the Mālikīs don't see that as being najis. So you don't have to go and, you know, wipe it off with pure water. Yeah. Yeah. Well, even that is a misappropriation of the ruling, but yes, we which is a big deal, right? Because especially if you're from an Arab country, and people here that are from Arab countries, you know what I'm saying. Like you've had maybe relatives, and when they see a dog, they're almost like, "Oh my God, like get it away from me." And really, it's, you know, there's a kind of abuse that happens to dogs in these countries too. It's gone down, which is nice. There have been a lot of people who have been advocating for, you know, the rights of animals and particularly dogs in these areas. So it's been good. But generally speaking, that is because, you know, the Shafi'i madhhab, for example, has a very strict ruling on this. If a dog does lick or touch an individual who follows that madhhab, they would then have to go and remove, you know, that lick, that saliva from their clothing or whatever with pure water. The Mālikīs don't, all right? Because the Mālikīs don't see it as impure. They actually see it as something that is pure. Bile, so like any like gastric reflux, for example, that which is released from the gallbladder, unless it changes. Eggs that are not addle, milk of a living human being, it's ṭāhir. Milk of a living animal. Okay, it's in other words, and this would also be milk of a living animal that's lawful for consumption. So, cows, sheep, camels. The urine and excreta of animals whose flesh is lawful, provided that they don't feed on filth. Now, it's still mandub, or recommended for one to rinse it off if this does get on you. And then a dead body of that which has no flowing blood. So like a fly or an ant or a worm or things like that. Okay. And they would say that which is not slaughtered properly. You know, there's a difference about leather and hair and these kinds of things from this, but we're not going to get into all of that. Khamr, alcohol that has been made into vinegar or has been dehydrated is also seen as ṭāhir. So once it becomes vinegar, you know, after going through the wine process. Medications which may have a certain percentage of alcohol. Okay, so there also, you know, the big one is cologne and perfume with a particular amount of alcohol percentage. Smoke, they say smoke that's derived from najasa, so something that is najis that then is burned, the smoke from it. And then the unshed from a slaughtered animal, so that's the natural remains of blood in the meat, that which is not flowing. Okay. Is also seen as ṭāhir. What is najis? Some things that are najis. The corpse of a human, okay, this is najis. Carcass of an animal with flowing blood, obviously. Milk from a dead body, milk from an animal whose flesh is forbidden, so like a donkey, pig. urine and excrement of jalala, which are animals that do feed on filth, the urine and excrement of a human being, the urine and excrement of an animal whose flesh is forbidden or that whose consumption is objectionable. They say like a lion or a wolf or something along those lines. And then bloody pus from inflammation, typically. So like the exudate of a wound. Okay, that would be najis. And then white pus. Flowing blood from a human being, vomit that has changed from the normal state of the food. In other words, it's mixed, right? So it's not like somebody swallowed something and then spit it back up, but it's now vomit. Alcohol, obviously. And then you have many, which is many, wadi, and medhi. So this is different types. So many is sperm, okay? Wadi is seminal urine, which is a type of prostatic fluid. So like a white fluid that may discharge, for example, after urinating. This is also najis. Medhi, which is a seminal fluid. Wedi, which is seminal urine. And then medhi, which is a seminal fluid. That's sort of like this clear, sticky fluid that lubricates typically that which precedes arousal. And then everything that flows from the body, like a scab, if it contains liquids or things like that, like a boil, right, if it's popped. And then things that are small in quantity, like smaller than the size of a coin, they say, are excused in relationship to this stuff. All right? Any questions about this? That which cannot be purified after coming into contact with something that is najis or impure would be meat that's cooked in najasa. All right, and this is a big one for people, going to restaurants and having their, meats that are cooked in some kind of khamr or alcohol, for example. Olive salted in najasa. They also talk about clay pots, that have been made in that way where najasa was submerged, like porous pots. And then, on the question, for example, that Haysam asked, I think it was Haysam, right? That asked about the question of the water coming from the pipes and the smell. So if we knew, for example, that that is sewage water, okay, that was filtered, it's somewhat questionable, okay? For many of the ulama, at least, there's a difference here. But you would have to know. Other considerations for this which is also very important, clothing from non-Muslims is not something that you assume is pure. Okay? And for no other reason other than they don't have the same types of conditions and guidelines that we do in our religion. Baby's clothing is also not assumed to be pure. Mud is assumed to be pure unless you see it. All right? So like if you're stepping in grass and there's mud, right? You don't assume, you say like, well, I've seen dogs walking here. I stepped in this. I must have najasa on me as a result of which. No, you would have to see it, yeah, and know that you stepped in it in order for that to happen. So you don't just assume that that's the case. They talk about, for instance, something falls on you and you're doubtful as to what it is, but you're in a Muslim community, you would assume it to be pure. If you're in a non-Muslim community, they say you would assume it to be impure, unless you were explicitly told. These kinds of things don't really apply. They may in certain situations, just because we're not really talking about a one-to-one correspondence anymore. But again, if you suspect something, it's better to err on the side of just cleaning whatever you need to clean. If a dog ate in food, the food is still valid to eat. Okay? But if he eats in a vessel, and this is the big one, it's only recommended, we shouldn't say only, it's recommended to wash the way that is typically described in the hadith. And if you wash it otherwise, it's also acceptable as well.
Can you explain what you mean by vessel?
It's just a plate or something that the dog ate out of. Yeah.
So I had like a bird poop on me and it was like more than a quarter. I had to I washed it off with water, but could I pray with that or would I have to wash it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as far as birds are concerned, typically birds, they're halal in terms of eating. We may not eat them, but that sort of is the guideline as to whether or not we would consider it to be halal or not. I would have to look and see, but I do think that they allow for that to be seen in the same way that they would see duck, for instance, or chickens.
Yeah, I heard the Mālikī is, but with Shafi'i it's not.
No, right? Yeah. You see why you chose this madhhab? Birds can poop on you. You're all good. You know what I'm saying? Okay. Any questions about any of this stuff?
Yeah, the pig. You said it's considered pure
Pure.
in Mālikī?
Yeah.
Like you just can't eat it, but you can touch it?
Can't. Yes. You can touch it. If you touch the pig, you don't have to go wipe it off with water or something like that. Yeah, this is a big one. Even for Malikis, this is a big one because most we're not really used to dealing with pigs, and so what we know of them becomes quite difficult for us to be okay with that. But
Is
that.
it a different view of every kind of Mālikī scholar, or is it just a general all Mālikī?
No, this is a general. This is something that is sort of by consensus in the school to a certain degree. In other words, every living animal is seen to be ṭahir in the Mālikī madhhab. All right. This section that I'm about to go through right now, really quickly, it's not in this text, but I think it's really important to understand. It's actually the etiquettes of relieving oneself, which is adab al-qada al-haja. But Majid, sorry, you have a question?
Yes, Sheikh. So, let's say if you have water that you can purify, is there a process to purify that water, like with filtering, or maybe distillation? Are those means of purifying, making it tuhur?
Yes. And like I said before, the discussion around sewage water is, it's a discussion. But if you followed the general parameters of distilling water, the proper protocols, right, of bringing water back into a place of purity, generally speaking, to where we would conventionally recognize it as pure water, then it's water. And it's pure and purifying, inshallah.
Ustadh, real quick, just in terms of carcass, would the meat of a pig, if someone was to work in a restaurant and they were to touch like bacon or something with their hand and put it in a fryer, I assume they'd have to wash off. I mean, what is?
Yeah, that's different because now we're talking about a dead animal.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good question.
And you just have to wash your hand? Is that what the person would have to do?
Correct. Yes. That's a good question. That's also a good question. Sometimes people assume that you have to make wudu if you touch something that's najis. You don't. You simply just wash the area that it's touched with water, with pure water. That's all you're required to do. You didn't lose your wudu or anything like that.
We still can't eat from the same road.
No, that's, no. Okay, so the adab qada al-haja, the etiquettes of relieving oneself, I'll go through these quickly, but they are important to go through, I think, inshallah. Technically speaking, the things that are from religious decorum are seen as recommended acts, generally speaking. Cultures are going to differ insofar as what their particular decorum would be. Egyptian adab is very different, for example, than Syrians, very different than Pakistanis, very different than West Africans, so on and so forth. And there are a lot of things in adab that are not necessarily from the Sharia per se, but there are some, for example, that are from the Sunnah. And generally, we would say that the religion and the methodology that is used in the foundations of our religion recognize beneficial custom as meriting a high degree of merit, and then also obviously something that can take on the function of law. Okay. So min adab qada al-haja, the first thing is julus bi tahirin. So you're going to a pure place. All right. The second thing is that you're covering oneself. Okay, especially if it's somewhat of an open area. And again, this is talking about it in respect to the whole gamut. So whether we're in our societies here, where a lot of this stuff has been taken care of already, or in different settings. And then he says, وَاعْتِمَادُهُ عَلَى رِجْلِهِ الْيُسْرَى. So, it's said that one should actually put the emphasis or lean on one's left side. Okay? يعني يستحب أن يعتمد على رجله اليسرى. So, that's something that's recommended, right? That you're leaning on the left side. And there is actually a lot of studies that have been shown to actually prove that one should put pressure on their descending colon, for example. And this is a preventative measure, some have said, for things like hemorrhoids and other. Raising the right leg, squatting, okay? It also says, and these are things that are really interesting, don't relieve oneself into wind. Duh. Don't relieve oneself into a hole. So like if you're out like on a campsite or something like that, these are obviously areas where animals live. So this is, you don't want to do that. Do not relieve yourself in places where people will sit, on roads, in shaded areas. Also min adab qada al-haja is to not make dhikr, okay, while this is happening. So you should not be, reciting the names of God or anything of the sort, reciting Quran. Enter into this space with the left foot, and then you are to exit with the right, right? And you actually enter into the space. There are a number of different adhkar that one can say. Does anybody know any? Yeah, أعوذ بك من الخبث والخبائث, right? Seek refuge in, any type of evil forces, male or female. You're actually to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim as you enter in, okay? And as you come out, you walk out with your right foot and you say Ghufranak, right, is one of the things that you can say, like, asking God for forgiveness. Some of the scholars say that you do that because it was the, one of the moments where you weren't able to remember God, right? And so because of that, then you're coming out and saying, forgive me for not having the ability to forgive you in this moment. Istibra, which is for men, which is, to when you're washing off the penis, to actually, you're to try to like milk the penis lightly, and to remove the last remnants. All right. This is also something. So like the wiping of this area is going to be extremely important for men as well, right? Oftentimes, especially in this cultural context, I've seen that it's something that women are expected to do. A lot of men don't do it, and for us, this is something that is a grave danger. And the reason, obviously, is because if you don't wipe, you are undoubtedly going to get urine on whatever it is, your underwear, things like that. And now you have najasa on your clothing. It has to be removed. This is especially important for children, right, to understand too. So, both men and women, we sit down when we relieve ourselves. Both men and women, we wipe, we make sure that everything is gone. So like we sit there, we're not like, a lot of times with kids, they want to go and like get going right away, right? So, we should tell them like, no, relax, wait, do it properly, wipe, and show them how to do this. And then, inshallah, that lasts with them as well.
I'm sorry, is water a must for men from the front?
Water is not a must for men so long as you've made sure that you've completely removed any type of drops of urine that remain. By the way, urinary incontinence has a different ruling. So this is not, for those people who have incontinence problems, okay, don't worry about this. Right? This is not something for you.
Do the men at least have to wipe 3 times and then go further?
Yeah, so it's not an at least. It's, one of the recommendations, for example, is to wipe an odd number of times. So if you can do it in 1, great. 3, great. 5, great. The important part is that it's clean, and you're able to know that you're clean. So to clean with toilet paper, then with water, if one is able to, is also meritorious. And again, all of these things, like we may be thinking, do we really need this level of detail? Like, and to be honest, this is actually something that psychologists have even looked into in relationship to one's psychological health. Like, knowing how to properly relieve oneself, how to purify oneself, staying clean in this way has massive repercussions on the way in which your entire sort of disposition, your emotional health, your physical health are going to be affected by this. And the opposite is absolutely true as well, right? And that's why this becomes such an important thing for Muslims. It was actually one of the identity markers for Muslims in Spain, for example. Right? Like they knew the Muslims because they were these really, really clean people, right, who always smelled really, really great. And that actually became one of the ways to identify the Muslims during the Reconquista. Right? So if they smelled something like oud or something, they would know, this guy's a Muslim and he's been hiding it from us. Right? And similar even with this particular decorum that we have of relieving ourselves. If one knew this, they would actually be called out.
Ustadh, is water meritorious for feces or
Both.
Or is it up for feces?
Both.
So it's not a must for feces.
It's only a must if if it has spread in a way that kind of necessitates it at that point. Right? In other words, the idea is that it's removed. So long as it's removed, it's sufficient.
Does that go for women, or we have to use water?
Goes for women as well, men and women.
So if you do get some drops of najis, either pee or poop, do you then just use water to remove it, and that should be sufficient? Like on your clothes?
Yeah, as long as you use water to remove it, that's sufficient. And all of the other things that we talked about as well, obviously, right? So, you can go through the list, semen or otherwise. So again, so removing anything that goes obviously outside of the areas that that one is relieving oneself. A man who has medhi should wash all of his private parts. So if in the course of one relieving themselves, you find, and this is for men typically, that some sort of seminal fluid came out, one should wash the entirety then of the penis.
That's for pre-ejaculatory fluid, correct? The lubrication?
The lubrication, correct, yes.
And does that include the penis and the testicles, or just the penis?
And the testicles too, yes. All right, any questions on that? Okay, so then he begins with a section on wudu. Wudu, generally, wada'a is to make something pure. There's actually a concept of light or illumination that comes out of it. There's a term that I heard Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talk about, lustration, I think it was called. It's an old English term that was used, and it literally was talking about a type of ritual purification. This is actually something that you'll find in many of the ancient traditions, whether Christian tradition, baptisms, for example, water ritual purifications. The Jews have this. Their rules actually are extremely similar to the types of rules that I've just talked about. Hindus have this. So, it's something that you'll find within many religious and spiritual traditions. It's an obligation for one to obviously have wudu to pray. So it's a condition, unless you have permissibility to do tayammum. Okay, so some scholars will say that it's fard. It's a fard on us, so long as one is capable of doing it. Right? If there's some necessary reason why someone would not be able to do it, and they say, for instance, like one is being chained to a wall or something along this, like you're in a cell or something, and you're unable to do any type of ritual purification, then it's removed from you. And so you have the minor ritual impurity, which is known as al-hadath al-asghar. So he says, فَرَائِضُ الْوُضُوءِ سَبْعَةٌ وَهِي دَلْكٌ وَفَوْرٌ نِيَّةٌ فِي بَدْئِهِ. The obligatory actions of wudu are 7 in the Mālikī madhhab. So you have rubbing or dalk, continuity, and intention at the outset. Check. Okay, I think we're back on. Okay, so he says فَرَائِضُ الْوُضُوءِ سَبْعَةٌ وَهِي دَلْكٌ وَفَوْرٌ نِيَّةٌ فِي بَدْئِهِ. The obligatory actions of wudu are 7: rubbing, continuity, intention at its outset. وَلِيَنْوِي رَفْعَ حَدَثٍ أَوْ مُفْتَرَضٍ أَوْ اسْتِبَاحَةً لِمَمْنُوعٍ عَرَضٍ. One must intend one of 3 things: the removal of a state of ritual impurity, the fulfillment of an obligation, or rendering worship permissible by removing a preventative to worship. So the discourse on this from the author is basically delineated into 3 parts. The first one is it's of the fara'id of wudu from the ayah وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ, that he has not commanded of you but to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with sincerity and making religion for him. And there are prophetic traditions. Obviously, the one that is most well known and widely regarded, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّةِ, verily all actions are judged by their intentions. So one must make intention at the outset of the wudu, which is what he indicates obviously when he says fi bad'ihi, that there's a at the outset of the actual wudu itself. Now the mashhur is that it's at the washing of the face, since that is the first compulsory component of the wudu. Some said it's at the washing of the hands and the arms, right? So the hands would actually include the arms as well. And this is what Khalil's opinion was on it. And then the وغسل وجه غسله اليدين ومسح رأس غسله الرجلين, and then washing the face, both hands, wiping over the head, and washing both feet. والفرض عم مجمع الأذنين والمرفقين عم والكعبين. The obligation concerning the aforementioned includes from ear to ear, up to and including the elbows for the arms and hands, and up to and including the ankles for the feet. خلل أصابع اليدين وشعر وجه إذا من تحته الجلد ظهر. Run the fingers through the other fingers of both hands when washing, and run the wet fingers through the facial hair, allowing the water to actually penetrate the skin if the underlying skin is visible through the facial hair. If it's not, and it's a thicker beard, a masah, wiping over it, is sufficient. So the 7 then, as he says, are: you have the face, washing the face, both hands, wiping over the head, and washing the feet. And then you have dalk, which is the rubbing for all of the parts of the body that require washing, continuity, and intention. Dalk, the concept of rubbing, is a very important concept in the Mālikī madhhab. In the Tawdīh of Ibn al-Hajib, he actually mentions that there's 3 opinions on this. The mashhur is that it's wajib. Ibn Abd al-Hakam said that it's not wajib. And then there's a 3rd opinion that says it's wajib not in and of itself, but rather in that it is a means to the wajib, which is isal al-ma', that the water actually penetrate the actual limbs themselves. And this should be done with the pouring of water or after. So either with the water, there should be rubbing happening, or you pour the water and then after it's poured on the limb, then the dalk actually happens. And then the continuity, or fawr, it's also known as mawala. Ibn Bashir says al-mawala is the performance of the act with one continuous action without it being cut off at any point. So it's one after the other. So fawr would be a continuous action, right? It's you're doing one body part after the other until you finish. And Ibn al-Hajim also commented that the lightly cutting off of the continuity is excused, and that's why he also will talk about this as well. And it's going to come at a later section. And then he goes into the Sunan al-Wudu. سننه السبع ابتداء غسل اليدين ورد مسح الرأس مسح الأذنين مضمضة استنشاق استنثار ترتيب فرضه وذا المختار. The sunan are 7. To begin by washing both hands. So you begin by just washing the hands up to and including the wrists. And then to return from the back to the front when you're wiping the head. So the head, typically this motion here is the wajib, as we said before, but then to go back from the back of the head to the top is a sunnah. And then to wipe both ears as well. And then madmada, which is the rinsing of the mouth, then lightly sniffing water into the nostrils, which is istinshaq, and then lightly blowing it out. It's light, as we said before, not hard, you're not blowing your nose. And then the tartib, which is following the correct order of the obligations, which is the best thing to do. Any questions about this? Okay, so from there then he goes into the fada'il, but we'll end here inshallah, and next time get into the meritorious acts of wudu, or what are the mandubat, بإذن الله تعالى. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.